voice and representation in women's collective struggles in South Africa for housing. So I want to start by telling you how I got to this paper. In 2007, a group of what are known in South Africa as backyarders, so people who are living in kind of makeshift structures in overflowing, overcrowded backyards. So here's a picture. You can see township housing and then backyard shacks. So people call themselves backyarders. They moved into they put their shacks up on a big open field in a township called Grassy Park in Cape Town. They were assisted by a woman named Lorraine Kienis, whose family had lived in a small informal settlement on the corner of an open field for over 60 years. And the field bordered on the other kind of diagonal side another informal settlement called Kabastral. Okay, so here's another example of backyards, and there's one more. Here's where the city wants them to go. It's called TRAs, or temporary relocation areas. People call them blikkiesdorps. A blikkie is a tiny little tin can. And they are tiny little tin cans. They're boiling hot in the summer and freezing cold in the winter. They're really far on the margins of the city, and they've been deemed unfit for human life unless considered temporary. And many of these have been up for 10 years or more. So people know that they're not going to be temporary, and they're going to be far from their kind of social networks of support. So in townships where there are overcrowding and backyards, people then take over open pieces of land to set up home. On the second day of the then mayor, Helen Zill's job, she came and said, you can't stay here on this field, but we'll move you to the corner of a sports field a few blocks away, and then we'll sort you out, we'll figure something out. A small number of people decided to get together, come from across the city to help resist in what became known as a land occupation. I at the time was doing research on the 50,000 people earmarked by government that year for relocation to these TRAs. And this is where they then set up, on the corner of the sports field. This is where Helen Zill had set them up, in a place that became known as Zillrain Heights, Zill after the mayor and Rain after Lorraine. And they've now been there for 7 years. And one of the reasons why they've been there is because of this group of people who came together to do research and launch a media campaign about their right to stay there and why they should be allowed to move there as opposed to forcibly relocated to the TRAs. This paper isn't actually, it doesn't come out of the Zillrain Heights case, but one of the reasons why we used the media and the research was there wasn't very many people involved who were willing to support. And when we look back at some of the most successful cases of land occupations in South Africa's history, we turn to the 1970s, and the reason why a lot of those campaigns had resulted in staying was because they were politicized and they used the media. So small numbers of people politicizing media campaigns to get to stay. The most famous of which is in Crossroads in Cape Town. So this is people in Zillrain Heights. Part of the research was to show that it's people who have homes and have established social networks that would be lost because the government's argument was they're unemployed there, they may as well be unemployed in Delft where the blikkiesdorps are. So this research was to do a survey of every single house and to present it to the media, who is there, why are they there, why should they be allowed to stay there, and using the Constitution. And one of the clauses in the South African Constitution is around people in vulnerable circumstances, women, children, disabilities. You can't evict people and make them homeless without taking those things into consideration, according to the law. So this was in front of one of their many court cases, a map of Zillrain Heights with who was there and why. And it was quite successful, and in part a lot of what they did was they interviewed people and used the history of the place and where people came from. They made a little 8-pager where they used oral history with a few of the residents as to why they were there. Because neighbors in those overcrowded areas were saying they're just trying to jump the queue for the housing waiting list. They're just queue jumpers, they're impatient. And they were saying, no, actually, we have legitimate reasons why we can't stay in basically garages and people's backyards. So what they were drawing on was these examples of resistance to forced removals in Cape Town. This is from Crossroads, which is the most famous of which. It was the only area deemed an African squatter camp in Cape Town to resist the bulldozers and the forced removals of the 1970s and 1980s. They were successful because of the collective public and political organizing of a group of women known as the Crossroads Women's Committee at the time. Every time they would be removed, they would come back, set up house. To the point that they had 22 congressmen in the U.S. Congress stand up and say, don't bulldoze Crossroads. So here's a picture of the larger kind of Cape Town area. There's Crossroads, it's right by the airport, so if anyone's ever been to Cape Town and gone into downtown, between there and there you're seeing Crossroads. So people came from all over. Every time one area was demolished, people would come to Crossroads. These were some of the women that I interviewed about that struggle. And I was asking them about what happened in this kind of famous case of Crossroads resistance, but then what happened since then? What happened to the individual women? What happened to the issue of forced removals and the right to housing in the city? And what happened to their organization? So these were some of the women involved, and this was them at the time. So these are archival photos of them. I knew I would put my notes. Okay. So here's what they were doing, and it was the issue of them taking control of having their story told in local media, through plays, through international alliances that won them the right to stay. So every time there were raids and demolitions, there would be photographers there, and it really publicized the issue and became a kind of cornerstone of the anti-apartheid struggle. If you look on the ANC website, the famous Women of Crossroads is there. It's kind of emblematic piece of history. So in 1998, so these are some of their media strategies that they used. This is Crossroads today, part of it. In 1998, about 300 women in Crossroads got together and sat in on council offices. And it became one of the first and one of the most intensive and prolonged service delivery protests that you see today. Today in South Africa, there's over 10,000 protests a year, mostly around public services, housing, electricity, water, education. But at the time, it was quite a shock for the ANC to be protested against. And it happened again for the first time in Crossroads. Yeah, so here's Crossroads today. Parts are formal housing, but parts are informal. Eventually, the government put up samples of show houses, and this was the kind of housing that they were planning on building. And this was what basically triggered women to get together and say, there's no way we've been waiting our whole entire lives for decent housing, and this is what we're going to get. These houses had no windows, they were shoddily built, you can see from the picture. So against this backdrop, women formed what was called the Women's Power Group in the late 1990s. And they had a list of grievances. They were talking about development money going missing, they were talking about schools, about creche, about safety and security. And they were able to attract over 300 women from across very deep personal, historic, geographical, and political divides. When their grievances weren't taken seriously by their local councillors, they approached the city council housing offices and eventually refused to move until their concerns were heard. So the sit-in started in January of 1998 on a rotating basis. 50 women at a time would come and sit and stay in the offices. And they very quickly captured the attention of the municipal and provincial authorities and the media. The ANC went and insisted that the ANC women disengage themselves from the Women's Power Group. The Women's Power Group underlying strength was its ability to unite across these differences. And after 4 months of court orders and meetings and investigations and arrests, things started to get violent in the rest of the township. And after a few months, all sides of the struggle had given up trying to prove legitimacy. And arson attacks, armed conflict, and murders began. Many women then fled from those offices to the Pan-Africanist Congress house And the state then supplied the Crossroads councillors with personal bodyguards. Go down. So here's some of the women I interviewed who were involved in the Women's Power Group. And I would like to just, here's some of these interviews. So for example, Mama Ngozi, she was involved, she was a key member. Her son was killed in the violence outside of the offices, and then at his funeral, her mother was stabbed to death. So it really was quite intense. And at a high cost, the Resented Housing Project was eventually called off. And the Crossroads protest legitimized ongoing service delivery protests in the city at large and gained a policy change from the Department of Housing. But at the same time, what then ensued was called a war of words and bullets. And I want to switch from what happened at the protest to the way that women were really quickly reinscribed in official dichotomies of explaining what happened and why. Every decade in Crossroads, there's been an official government commission for one reason or another. And this one about the protest has very little about the women. There's a few of them that were interviewed. You can tell by the way that the questions were set up. They weren't interested in asking anything about what and why they were doing. It was about the kind of who was who in the kind of wider protest around competing political party patronage. And so turning from the substance of the sitting to the discursive and rhetorical battles to define the sides in conflict, I want to go into that a little bit. That's right. So women were quickly discredited with being backwards and against progress, with being pro-vigilante and against democracy, with being newcomers with little standing to represent or claim historical rights to Crossroads. And in isolation, it's easy to refute each one of the accusations. But I think it's important to engage in the debates because they were powerful arguments, and they were in many ways successful attempts to re-script and undermine the actions of the Women's Power Group and write them out of political debates. These labels prescribe narrow polarizations with little insight into political and historical geography of women's experiences and perspectives. So now the famous story of Crossroads is still there, and it's never linked with this protest post-apartheid. Women were called pawns of shack lords. The counselor there, who's been counselor for life, he holds MK credentials from the anti-apartheid armed struggle. He's been the local counselor since 1996, and he's still the counselor today. So what he told me, he said, the women's movement slaughtered the people who have supported the development. When the women's power was beaten up and chased out by the community, then violence stopped and the construction of houses went smoothly. The houses are still not all built now, so that's 8 years later. And in fact, there was what's it called, when you take out a court order that he wasn't allowed to go near the building site in the last 2 years. So during this time, women were divided into traditionalists and Democrats, and ANC or PAC. And the traditionalists, the traditionalists as compared to people involved in official party politics is interesting. I think they're equally potentially autocratic. And women described their choice, and they said, in 1994, nothing changed because the councillors were leading with an iron rod. Ever since we have voted, they have replaced the chiefs with councillors. They, the councillors, repeated exactly what the chiefs had done before because there were rifts between them and the people, and they excluded us when making decisions. Even describing the Women's Power Group was a contested terrain. The Commission said that the Women's Power Group was an interest group allied with the PAC against the ANC councillors. And they said any ANC women who joined were defectors to the PAC. They said they were irrational, they were anti-ANC, anti-development, anti-progress. And in the analysis of the South African police, the director of police, Mr. Mpembe, was typical of the sweeping generalizations made about the Women's Power Group from high-level officials. He said the root cause of violence was the rivalry between the traditionalists or warlords and the Democrats starting in the 1980s. The warlords are now part of a civic called Mukusa, which is a traditionalist organization which is in conflict with the more democratic organization Senko. The Women's Power Group is a brainchild of the warlords, especially masterminded by Nongwei in opposition to development. So there's all sorts of examples. They have a section on rivalries between traditionalist versus progressive leadership style. And at the end, the commission vindicated the councillors and said, no, this was just a PAC scam to undermine the ANC. So women's experiences and voices were not just written out, but written in and incorporated in a way where they were manipulated and undermined. At the end, the commission said there's a culture of violence and a warlord mentality of kill your opponents or chase them away. And the mayor at the time, Yoma India Feketo, she testified at the commission, and she says, this problem can be solved with education regarding political tolerance and the right of people to different opinions and different political allegiances. But there's nothing in there about the day-to-day life, about housing policy, about redistribution of wealth and services in South Africa. So, in conclusion, I think this is a powerful example of a lost history, but also a manipulated history. And in more recent days, people then skip over this kind of generation or cohort of resistance history and look back to the 1970s and say, there's only a few of us, we're facing high levels of state brutality and militarization. Our best bet then is to hold on to the mechanisms of telling our own story through media and through campaigns that are very strategic in holding on to the plot, regardless of how these protests and land occupations often are in the end demobilized. But the sense of whose stories can be told, not just about particular people's experiences, but about the context and about what's happened in South Africa since 1994. In a diminished truth, Mahmoud Mamdani argues that the absence of any mention of the social catastrophe of the 20 million apartheid forced removals in the victim-perpetrator setup of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was the equivalent to a truth commission established in the Soviet Union under Stalin that ignores the Gulag. And I think that the link between why these stories were not told in the TRC and why they're not told in the following commissions in Crossroads is only one of many of the reasons why these women are kind of highlighted and hero worshipped and frozen in time in the kind of official narratives and history of the anti-apartheid movement, and then in reality today live quite marginalized and disempowered lives. So I'm going to end there. This is Adrinette Kwana. She was one of the women involved in the Women's Power Group. It was her partner, Mama Ngozi's son, who was killed at the time she was pregnant. And since the Women's Power Group, they're still resisting the official development. Behind them is a section of Crossroads called Boys Town, and this is a container where developers came to set up, to build, and they burnt the container and chased them out. So women are widely acknowledged to make up the majority of membership of these very well-known kind of social movements. They're at the coalface of conflict between the community and the state, yet their struggles are disconnected from the widely celebrated histories of the women's movement. These disjunctures are constructed on multiple levels as women politicize their struggle to expose the boundary making that barred them from life in the city. The way their lives, their movements, and their histories unfold in very different and often contradictory directions defies the very neat boundaries of victim, hero, comrades versus sellouts, apartheid versus post-apartheid, and they leave their lived experiences in a gray area without words or labels that reflect their own realities, which is an attempt at what I was trying to do here, but also more importantly is something that ongoing struggles today are trying to learn from and make sure that they then have some sort of say in at least explaining what it is